Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Vintage series, a video series focused on the vintage format of Magic the Gathering. As this is the first episode, I would like to thank you all for watching. I plan to do more deck techs and some in-game play as well as the future with the series. If you'd like to support this content and would like to see more of it, please head over to patreon.com/volrathxp and also subscribe to my channel on YouTube. Without further ado, our first deck tech episode is going to be focused on a well-known deck in the vintage community, a deck known as Ravager Shops. What is Ravager Shops? Ravager Shops is a colorless aggro prison strategy that hinges on the use of the card Mishra's Workshop. Mishra's Workshop is essentially a black lotus for colorless mana, but that mana is restricted to only being able to cast artifact spells. Part of the deck's game plan is to prevent the opponent from casting spells and using mana while establishing powerful game-winning threats such as Arcbound Ravager and Walking Ballista. What are the pros and cons of playing Ravager Shops? Some of the pros of this deck are that it can be very explosive, capable of cutting it off its opponent from being able to even play the game at times. Between lock pieces and its aggressive threats, it can close games out quickly, while the opponent flounders to find interaction to get out of it. The deck is also very rewarding to put time into long term. It rewards careful and patient play, and its threat base is very high to the majority of the format. Some of the cons of this deck, however, are that the ever-present artifact hate within the format. Especially as decks like Paradoxical Storm become more popular, decks have begun to play main deck artifact hate, ranging anywhere from Null Rod and Stony Silence to Ancient Grudge. This means more possible opportunity to get shut out of a game in Game 1, and even more so in Game 2. In addition, Shops is a very difficult master. It can be very punishing to a player if they are unable to sequence their plays properly, so if you're looking for something that is a little bit easier to learn to play, this might not be the deck for you. Furthermore, if you don't enjoy prison strategies or making your opponent unable to play the game, this also might not be the deck for you. As I noted earlier on, one of the most important core cards of this deck is the land Mishra's Workshop. This land is an automatic 4-of in this deck, as all of the deck's most explosive openers usually begin with a Workshop. Next, we have Arcbound Ravager, another common 4-of in this deck. Arcbound Ravager is a threat, a finisher, and protection all in one. Its ability can protect other pieces from cards like Dak Phaeton, but it can also be used in combat to push through extra damage that might just end the game. Foundry Inspector is a relatively new piece to the deck, coming out of the Kaladesh block. Its primary effect is that it reduces the cost of artifact spells by 1 mana, but at the same time it is a 3-power creature that can attack the opponent. Many busted starts can be found by getting an Inspector into play. Walking Ballista is another common 4-of in this deck, as it combos well with Arcbound Ravager to push through damage to the opponent. Steel Overseer is a card most will know from the modern archetypes of Affinity. This card provides acceleration to the clock as well as ability to buff Arcbound Ravager and Walking Ballista. In addition, it can synergize with Mishra's Factory as well. Phyrexian Revoker is an important card to any Workshops list, as one of the primary Shops threats that exist is this card Dak Phaeton. Being able to shut off Dak, in addition to also being able to sometimes shut off Moxen or a Black Lotus, is very powerful and important. Revoker is also one of the more important cards in the Mirror Match, due to the fact that it can shut off opposing Steel Overseers, Walking Ballistas, or Arcbound Ravager. Sphere Resistance is one of the last remaining lock pieces to be unrestricted in this deck, increasing the cost of all spells by 1 mana for all players. With the advent of Foundry Inspector, it is actually possible to lower the cost of artifact spells just enough that Sphere is not a detriment to you, but brutal for your opponent. Phyrexian Metamorph's power level is that it can be any creature or artifact in play, making it 3 copies of whatever you need it to be at any given time. In addition to really only costing 2 life and 3 mana, Metamorph also makes the resulting copy an artifact, which means you could copy non-artifact creatures with it and have it still work well with cards like Steel Overseer. And Hangerback Walker is another card that synergizes well with Earthbound Ravager, often be able to sacrifice itself with multiple counters to make Thopter tokens, and then using Arcbound Ravager's ability to pile counters onto one of the Thopters for damage. In the mana base, besides the presence of Mishra's Workshop, we have the land Ancient Tomb, which taps for 2 colorless at the downside of taking 2 damage. It is important to learn to manage your life total with this card, as you can quickly put yourself into a point where you are unable to actually tap it for mana, for fear of the fact that you may actually just die to it. Mishra's Factory is another utility land that appears in this mana base, as it is capable of swinging through for damage, in addition to making a powerful surprise blocker, since it has the ability to tap to pump itself after declaring blockers. Finally, Wasteland is one of the deck's major ways of debilitating your opponent's mana base. It is never really considered a land, but rather is a land destruction spell that for non-basic lands that is free. The restricted cards that Ravager Shops plays are all varied and for the most part, mana. Besides the pieces of the Power 9 that the deck plays, it gains access to restricted mana cards such as Mana Crypt, Sol Ring, and Tolarian Academy, while the other half of the restricted cards are taxing or prison effects that have been deemed too powerful as foras over the years in Vintage, having been restricted in attempts to deflate the power of Shops as a deck. This includes cards like Chalice of the Void, Trinisphere, Thorn of Amethyst, and Lodestone Golem. In addition, the card Strip Mine is also here, being an additional restricted answer to opponents' lands, including those that are of the basic variety. The sideboard of Shops can be broken down into a few different categories, and while this particular sideboard shown on the screen is never truly set in stone, some things always hold true. For instance, it is always a smart idea to pack some form of graveyard hate, usually at least 6 to 7 cards worth due to the presence of decks like Dredge and Survival. In this case, Grafdigger's Cage and Tormod's Crypt are the hate cards of choice, but cards like Leyline of the Void have been known to see play on occasion as well. Grafdigger's Cage has the upside of being good against Oath of Druids as well, making it multi-purpose hate. In addition to graveyard hate, oftentimes additional creatures are needed for the purposes of the mirror match. Cards like Hangerback Walker, Wormcoil Engine, and even ones like Precursor Golem are all powerful options. Some players have even played cards like Gutshot to deal with creatures like Phyrexian Revoker and Steel Overseer in the mirror match. Forms of permanent-based hate are often also important for dealing with combo decks like Paradoxical Outcome that lay on Moxen and Artifact mana. Cards like Ratchet Bomb and Powder Keg can be useful for this purpose, while some players have gone deeper into cards like Null Rod with the intent of defeating decks like PO. While the core of the deck is for the most part set in stone, there are a number of flex spots in the deck in which many players have played many different cards. Cards like Sky Sovereign, Console Flagship, Triskelion, Traxos Scourge of Krug, and even Chief of the Foundry have seen play in this deck, both main and sideboard. Even newer cards like Sorceress Spyglass have seen play, being capable of not only showing you what deck you're playing against, but also giving you a pretty good idea of what to name with the effect. Here we have a relatively simple sample hand out of the deck. This hand has capability of making some interesting turn 1 plays, and it is possible to consider how to sequence it. One of the things to remember with sequencing with this deck is that unless you are attempting to make your board look unattractive to a hate effect, it often makes sense to play artifact mana first before playing a land, so that you are slightly masking your deck to your opponent. In these cases, it is often notable that your opponent is unlikely to counter artifact meta like a Black Lotus because they don't know actually what deck you're on. In this particular hand, one common line would be to play Black Lotus and crack it immediately to cast Foundry Inspector. From that point, you could either play Tolarian Academy or Ancient Tomb and cast one of the lock pieces, such as Sphere of Resistance or Thorn of Amethyst. My personal take on this would be to play Academy and run out Sphere of Resistance first, since even against more creature-based matchups, it is unlikely that they will be able to make a turn 1 play except for a Moxen maybe. Revoker is not a card you are typically going to want to play on turn 1 like this, due to the fact that it is a very reactive card, meaning you're going to want to be aware of what deck your opponent is playing before deciding do you need to have a Revoker down sooner or later. Another line here is that if your opponent possibly Force of Wills your Foundry Inspector, then you can proceed to play the Ancient Tomb and then attempt to cast Seer Resistance or Thorn of Amethyst. More than likely, your opponent is not going to have a second Force of Will to deal with the effect. A lot of players these days have gotten wise to the fact that Foundry Inspector provides free mana, and now they are attempting to combat that by actually using counter magic on Foundry Inspector. So it is a possibility that if that's what your opponent does, then you can react by attempting to cast an additional lock piece. At that point, you are kind of left with this hand at the mercy of your draws by drawing into an actual threat, but Phyrexian Revoker could possibly also shut something down, like a Moxen or a Black Lotus or something like that. So it is a very good hand. You have a potential upside to draw into quite a bit of good material. So it's something that you just have to kind of play the deck and learn how hands function with the deck. Again, this deck can be very powerful in the right hands, and while it takes time to learn how to evaluate opening hands and sequence your plays, it is a rewarding deck. While it can be unforgiving at times to mistakes, oftentimes the raw power of the deck and its pieces can squeeze through wins. And not only is this deck powerful and fun, but it is also one of the more inexpensive decks to build through Magic Online, currently at this time of this recording at around 248 tickets. This wraps up our very first deck tech on the Vintage series. In the future, I will be planning on doing content on gameplay recordings, not just with Ravager Shops, but with other decks within the Vintage format. If you like this content and wish to support me, please subscribe to my YouTube channel in addition to potentially pledging to my Patreon. Again, that is patreon.com/volrathxp. Until next time, keep casting Moxen and keep cracking them lotuses.